I suppose I should press continue, should I not?
Yes. Yeah, press continue.
I don't have any. What would I be pressing? I don't
Well,
have it. I didn't get a prompt.
I don't know. She might have gotten a prompt, but you don't have to worry
You're
about it.
fine.
You're
You're
fine.
good.
You're fine. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're delighted to be hosting Peter Osnos, along with Eva Hoffman and Gara LaMarche, all here to talk about a new book about the wealthy financier, philanthropist, and activist, George Soros, entitled appropriately, George Soros, A Life in Full. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of George Soros. Soros has been the subject of several biographies, but this new book isn't a traditional biography. Rather, it attempts to describe this complicated, controversial, and consequential world figure through a series of essays by a collection of contributors who offer a range of perspectives. Some of the writers have known the 91-year-old Soros personally and have worked closely with him. Others have dealt on their own with the same issues as Soros. The pieces were brought together in this volume by Peter Osnos, who knows Soros and as founder and previous head of public affairs, published all of Soros's books since 1998. Peter himself has enjoyed a distinguished careers in both journalism and publishing. He spent nearly 2 decades at the Washington Post as both a reporter and editor. He was, in fact, my editor there when I was a foreign correspondent. Then he switched careers, entering the book publishing world by joining Random House, where he worked as a senior editor and associate publisher before leaving to establish public affairs. Last year, he came out with his own engaging autobiography, Watching History Happen. Now, I'm going to turn the screen over to Peter, who will introduce Eva and Gara, both of whom contributed essays to the book. So Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Brad. First of all, I just would like to say that I want to congratulate you, Brad, on outlasting Jeff Bezos as the owner of a physical bookstore, as you wrote in the Washington Post the other day, a newspaper where, as you point out, both you and I worked, and which is now owned by Bezos. So all I can say is, Brad, bold, taking on Mr. Bezos. This is the first event of the series that we're going to be doing about Jeff's book, about the Soros book. Eva is in London. Gara is in New York or Stonington, Connecticut. So if there are any kind of, as we weave the threads together from disparate places, that's an explanation. I think that very briefly, the story of the book is that in the summer of 2020, George Soros turned, I keep saying I want to say Soros and not George, even though I know him well enough to say George, that it was his 90th birthday, but no celebration was possible. And as his publisher for almost a quarter of a century, I said, well, you know, Mr. Soros, George, is it time for you to write either a memoir or an autobiography? And of course, he said no. And we both understood that efforts to write a biography of Mr. Soros had not succeeded in the past. Several have been tried because there's so much. No one author can really encapsulate the very many things that Mr. Soros represents. And on the cover of the book, we point out that he's a financier, a speculator, a philanthropist. He's a political activist. He's a nemesis of the far right. He's a Holocaust survivor. He is a man who truly in the now 10th decade has been through an extraordinary life. And so each of the people who have contributed to the book are people who have particular expertise in the area that they're talking about. So most of the authors, contributors, knew George, knew Soros one way or another. Ava did not. She was the only one who actually had never met Soros. And that posed a particular challenge, which I think she did a brilliant job. And why was Ava the person to do the essay she did? Because George Soros, if you ask him, will tell you that 1944 was the most consequential year of his life. He was 14 years old. The Nazis had just arrived in Hungary. And it was the year in which the Soros family somehow made it successfully without anybody being butchered. Ava herself, I'm sure most of you know, is a really tremendously distinguished author of books in this arena. After Such Translation, which was a book essentially about being herself a Polish-born woman right after the Holocaust. She was born right afterwards, eventually and eventually emigrated, has had a very distinguished career as a journalist and writer. Her book, After Such Knowledge, tells the story of what will we know after the last survivor of the Holocaust is gone. And so she spent a great deal of time on Zoom with Mr. Soros. And I can tell you that because he didn't read any of the essays until the book was finished, that was our deal, he was really very moved. So Ava, why don't you, just 1 second, I think I'll go to Gara first so that he knows we know he's here. Gara himself has an amazingly full career in progressive activism. As he said, he was at the ACLU in Texas. Later, he was the associate director of Human Rights Watch, where he was succeeded but not replaced by my wife, Susan, at Human Rights Watch. Later, he was the first director of all US programs for the Open Society Foundations. And he's just recently completed his tour or tenure as president of the Democracy Alliance, which is a group of donors of capacity who support progressive causes. He is going to be talking, obviously, in his own specialty, his expertise, is George as a political activist and what makes him unique, what makes him distinctive. So let's go to Ava. Why don't you tell us a bit about your essay?
Right. So my brief.
And be sure that everybody can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good. Well, my brief in my essay was to write about George Soros's childhood, which was spent during a very interesting period in Hungary. And to give some context to my answer, he said at some point that 1944-45 was the most formative period of his life, or sometimes he has said it was the happiest period of his life. To give some context to this, so George Soros was born in 1930 in Budapest. In 1944-45, when he was 14 years old, Hungary was invaded by the Nazis, and the most violent phase of the war, including the Holocaust, arrived in Hungary. And of course, during the Holocaust, it was the Jewish population of Hungary which was most endangered. And of course, George Soros is Jewish. But Soros spent the year in hiding with his adored father, Tivadar, and his older brother. And many years later, he wrote the following in a foreword to his father's memoir, which was called Masquerade, interestingly, and about which one of the truly interesting facts, I think, is that it was first written in Esperanto, the international language. So this is what George Soros wrote in the introduction to Masquerade. It is a sacrilegious thing to say, but these 10 months were the happiest times of my life. We were pursued by evil forces, and we were clearly on the side of the angels because we were unjustly persecuted. Moreover, we were trying not only to save ourselves, but also to save others. What more could a 14-year-old want? Towards the end of the war, the Nazis were replaced by the Russians as the Soviet Union entered Hungary. And although they were the putative liberators, they too perpetrated terrible cruelties on Hungary's population. So in a sense, 1944 was for 14-year-old Soros a great adventure. In a way, sort of, not mimicking, but echoing his father's great adventure. His father also had great adventure of being lost in Siberia and being persecuted, etc., etc. So towards the end of the war, the Nazis were replaced by the Russians as the Soviet Union entered Hungary. And although they were the putative liberators, they too perpetrated terrible cruelties on Hungary's population. So as I said, in a sense, 1944 was for 14-year-old Soros a great adventure. And in its course, he learned that he was highly resourceful and could stand up to danger. At some point, he was sent on a rather dangerous mission by his father, who clearly put his full trust in his younger son, which involved a financial transaction from which George emerged triumphant, perhaps in a foreshadowing of his later career. And it is interesting that writing later on, Soros emphasizes that there was a moral component to his happiness. In hiding, the Soros men were on the side of the angels. And by the way, I'm just going to interject something about a particular episode, which was also a moment of a moral test, when a young German Nazi soldier somehow wandered into the Soros hiding place by accident. And Tivadar, the father, says that he looked like the very example of, Aryanness, of the kind of Aryanness which was involved in the persecution of the Jews. And so the question was what to do with this young man. And young George, with tears in his eyes, said, "Please, let's let him go." And they did. And, this was a very interesting moment of an ethical choice, of a moral choice. He understood, that this young German boy was not to be blamed for everything that his country had done. And
but let me say that what your description is truly exactly right of the various strands that made George what he became, which was someone willing to take almost beyond imagining risks. Because if you survived in Hungary in 1944, you knew from risk. Because his father's model of how you get things done, which are driven by instinct, not necessarily by instructions, is very much what George has followed in the time since. I'm going to turn to Gara and say, we now know that once George first went to London and then at the LSE, and then he came to the United States. And over time, he became, as everybody will recognize, a multi-billionaire, a major philanthropist, and strikingly, the focus of so much right-wing attacks I've always said that that's an element there of anti-Semitism and an element of just conspiracy theories and so forth. But Gary, you are truly in a position to describe what it was like being with George on politics and why it is that this trope has developed about his role, his influence.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. You asked whether I was in Stonington or Brooklyn. I'm in Brooklyn. We've now moved in underneath our grandchildren. So the stomping you may hear is the grandchildren running around. The first thing to say about George in politics, I think George Soros in politics, is that was a reluctant and is a reluctant to some extent political activist. He doesn't really like politics that much. He lacks the kind of appetite for the horse race and all that he's not interested in the transactional part of it or the relational part of it. Particularly, a lot of rich people get involved in politics to stroke their own egos. Soros was, a political giver at not an enormous level for many years until in the early 2000s, he became very alarmed by the Bush administration and the war in Iraq and the war on civil liberties at home. And he dealt with it. I was running his foundation at the time, his US foundation, and we had a lot of responses to that in the foundation. But in the political side of his life, which I wasn't involved with because the foundation has to have a wall between his politics and his philanthropy. On the political side of his life, he decided he wanted that beating Bush and getting Bush out of office would have an enormous impact on all the things he cared about domestically and globally. So he set about to do that. And the story of that is told in the book, and I won't tell it all here, except to say that what Soros's kind of main way of operating in politics is to empower grassroots organizations, to do their own work. I've studied and worked with a lot of other political actors. If you look at Bloomberg, if you look at Steyer on the left, if you look at the Koch brothers, for instance, they're often creating their own organizations, their own operations. Soros never did that. He has one political aide. And what he has done is invest in grassroots organizing. That's what he did in a very big way in 2004 by funding a group called Americans Coming Together. He didn't design it. A number of people came to him and he liked the idea. I think that's another thing about Soros's philanthropy, which I'm more familiar with, but it also characterizes his political involvement, is that he is responsive to the ideas of others and he doesn't micromanage. So I think in the political realm, you would say that he has consistently backed grassroots organizing. The 2004 investments in Americans Coming Together, which were not enough to get John Kerry into the White House, were actually instrumental in what became the Obama campaign, the people-powered campaign in 2008. He's also was an early person to recognize the importance of data in politics and has invested in organizations like Catalyst that has really helped the progressive side with data. Everything he does in conjunction with other donors. As big as he is as a donor, he's always wanted to have partners. So he was a founder of the Democracy Alliance, which I used to head, and all the things he did in politics, as in philanthropy, he's done with significant other partners. He never wants to be the only person in it. He was early in recognizing political talent, particularly people of color, leaders of color, like Barack Obama, who he endorsed over his friend Hillary Clinton in 2008 in a way that was significant for Obama's candidacy. He was an early backer of Stacey Abrams. He's always had a very good eye for political talent and investing in leadership, as in fact he does in his philanthropic side. And I think he's kind of helped make markets in politics as in philanthropy. He was and remains one of the architects of the strategy to elect progressive prosecutors to have an impact on the criminal justice system. And some of his earliest political forays were not so much into candidates as they were into issues. So all the early referenda on medical marijuana and the decriminalization of marijuana, which is now actually, a very significant trend, including in conservative states, Soros invested in 20 years ago before anybody else did. So he's a very savvy investor in politics as in philanthropy. As to the question of why he's become such a nemesis, I think Peter, of course, you touched on it. He he didn't used to have a kind of a left political identity. And in fact, if you ask Soros about his own politics and ideology, he wouldn't describe himself, and he isn't. I know this very well. I mean, worked closely with him. He isn't really a figure of the left. He'd actually prefer to describe himself as something that is an endangered species, if not an extinct species, which is kind of a Rockefeller Republican. He believes that the revival of a moderate Republican Party would be one of the best things for democracy, although he doesn't really have the power to do that, and you have to deal with the Republican Party that you have. So I went early on in his political activity. He took me with him to a group of, he was invited to a dinner at the home of a United States senator. They had monthly dinners over spaghetti of several Republicans and several Democrats in a different time, obviously, about 15 or 20 years ago in the US Senate. And, you know, before Soros had become notorious in his political activity, before he was more identified with drug policy reform and criminal justice reform, he was a figure who had relationships and respect on the right and on the left. But when he put his head up politically in the Bush era, he kind of cast his lot in a way that made him a convenient boogeyman for the right. Yes, the kind of Jewish financier kind of thing taps into all kinds of anti-Semitic tropes, you know, the kind of outside agitator. He's just become a very useful foil. And there's a big difference between who Soros actually is and the caricature that's been created on the right because they find it useful.
That's exactly right, Gary. One of the things that, I talking to George about what it feels like to have your name constantly vilified. Somebody did, one guy put a bomb in his mailbox. In Hungary, in order to get on the bus, you had to step on his face. Tucker Carlson at Fox just did a 1-hour show devoted entirely to Soros. A woman, a state senator in Arizona last week said basically the war in Ukraine is because of George Soros and the Clintons. That she was a state senator. I mean, the level of that stuff. So if you say to George, it must be awful to be subject to this kind of thing. And he'll say, look, I'm very old, I'm very rich. How much can they really do to me? He's had this extraordinary equanimity, except whenever anything touches on his father or his personal background in Hungary would suggest that somehow it was nefarious, then he sues. I just want to very, very, very briefly tell you a little bit about the other essays in the book. Ava dealt with the survivor. Sebastian Mallaby, who's many of you will know his work as a really superb writer about finance, explains George as the billionaire speculator, which is what he calls himself. And what he will do what he does in that essay is show that George, again, is a man of instinct rather than following somebody else's rules. He created, in effect, what we now know as the hedge fund. As a philanthropist, the essay is by Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, who says that what's different about George in philanthropy is that most of his philanthropy is about values. It's not about having his name on the door. It's not about the kind of traditional way in which people record their legacy. As a philosopher, Michael Ignatieff deals with, I think it's one of George's greatest goals was to be known as a philosopher. But one of the things he's done is create Central European University, which does not have his name. It used to be in Budapest, and then Orban forced it into Vienna. And one of the things about George's philosophy is that he is someone who creates institutions, but is not himself an institutionalist. Gareth discussed the far right nemesis issue. George has also been very active in the post-Cold War period. And what I say about the war in Ukraine is, on the one hand, it shows the great failure of George's efforts at open society in Russia, where he devoted a great deal of time in the early years. He was giving every scientist $300 who needed it. But also, on the other hand, Poland, Romania, Moldova, even Hungary is supporting the sanctions. These are all places in which civil society endorsed by George and George's foundations has actually made a mark. And China, George has spent a lot of time and energy on China. Orville Schell is the great China expert. And he explains how the hope that George had that the Deng Xiaoping era would lead to a kind of truly transformation of China, it didn't happen. And what we now know, of course, is we've last seen Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin holding hands. I would say that all of it is capacious. And the strength, as the editor of the book, I will say this, is that each of the essays stands alone as a really clear explanation of those aspects of what George has done. And although, of course, there's its tapestry, they overlap a little bit. So Anne Applebaum, we asked her for a blurb for the book, and she said it's better than a conventional biography because it contains all these different elements. Eva, you know, you're a historian in your way, as well as a journalist. And I'm just wondering what, as you look forward to the rest of this century and so on, George, despite his best efforts, one day will no longer be among us. What do you think that the 90, whatever it turns out to be, 110 years of George's life, how do you think his legacy will be perceived?
Well, this is a difficult question. You know, I am in a way laboring under the disadvantage of not knowing, of being the one person among you who doesn't know George. But I think, you know, maybe his legacy will be pursued through the efforts of establishing moral politics. Of establishing, you know, political morality and moral politics. You know, the amazing boldness of his philanthropic vision, which I think will continue to be, you know, much needed as, you know, as the world goes on. And he has really been, you know, amazingly, he's been visionary in his philanthropy, it seems to me. And in his effort, you know, to interject, you know, democracy and human rights into societies which have not had them. You know, he hasn't been uniformly successful, but, you know, he has been successful in many places. You know, he has been incredibly inventive. I mean, certainly, you know, the societies of Eastern Europe, which he supported, you know, through his, you know, human rights work, even before 1989, and then, you know, since 1989, have really been transformed by what he has done. And you know that transformation is now deeply embedded in the DNA of these countries, and it will continue. And you know, this is going to be much, much, much needed in the near future and perhaps the further future. I mean, you know, we have had a great sort of revival of democracy after 1989, but I'm afraid that right now we have the age of dictators. You know, you know, we have many triumphant dictators, and you know, the democracies have become weakened in many ways. They have become, I think, in a way, you know, perhaps decadent. And it will be very important to think about George Soros's principles as we go.
And Eva, you understand also the consequences of being a refugee, being someone whose world has been taken from you.
Yeah.
What we're seeing right at this moment is how millions, literally, of Ukrainians are flocking into Poland, flocking into the other, but not going to Russia, tell us just a little bit about how you identify yourself as a refugee and what you understand about George as a refugee, as an outsider, as someone whose a substantial part of his life was shaped elsewhere. And then you came, and now you have this new identity.
Yes, well, I think, I think of myself as an outsider much more than as a refugee, in fact. I mean, it was my parents who were refugees, from the Ukraine, as it happens. But I was not a refugee, I was an immigrant, and I've been a multiple immigrant and an outsider. Now, being an outsider can be a very uncomfortable position, which at the same time can give you great insight into societies which you find yourself in. It gives you, a sort of vantage point from the outside. I mean, as it happens, I have been treated very well in the countries where I have lived, where I have emigrated to. But as I say, I mean, I don't know. I haven't thought about it much really in relation to George, but undoubtedly his outsider position in the United States has given him an extremely penetrating vision into the problems of that society. Mm-hmm. And of course, he has been very active in trying to counteract those problems. And
he is an American citizen and in his own way very patriotic. And I should have mentioned that Leon Botstein, the president of the bar, who knows George extraordinarily well, has written quite a remarkable closing essay on the nature of how George's Judaism, Hungarian origins, and so forth affect both his looking backwards and his sense of going forwards. And it's Leon's extraordinarily adept at making that sensible. Gara, do you think, as someone who really knows a great deal about American politics, do you think the effort that George has made to sort of resuscitate the grassroots, to bring along open society values into politics in America, do you think the nature of what he seems to represent can actually work in a society in which, on a daily basis, someone like George is being attacked on Fox News by people like Tucker Carlson, who really literally think of him as the devil incarnate? How much influence can somebody have in a world in which there's so much resistance?
Well, I mean, look, I don't think George, George contains contradictions like all of us do in the progressive side. I mean, he's a person who has probably been as big a supporter of efforts to remove the influence of money in politics as anybody. It's one of the first issues we took on 25 years ago when we launched the US programs, and yet he is one of the biggest political givers because we're not in a situation where people can unilaterally disarm. So the thing that's different about George than the Koch brothers or some of the people on the right is that George is working to bring about a world in which he would actually have, by virtue of his money, less power and influence. He's acting against his economic interests. He's not trying to protect his tax breaks or oil depletion allowance or things like that. He wants a world in which rich people like him are taxed more for the public good, and where philanthropy is relatively less significant. I think that the only way, in my view, and I can't speak for how George Soros thinks about it inside his head, but the only way I think to responsibly spend in either the political realm or the philanthropic realm, vast sums of money, is to make sure that you're doing it to empower groups that have been traditionally marginalized. And that is the theme that is run through George's philanthropy and through his politics. There was a question in the chat or in the Q&A about what has George done with respect, how does he see, people of color, women, how does that fit into his philanthropy? I would say that, the vast majority of the money in the United States is going to grassroots organizations of color, because the building of the kind of the grassroots capacity of groups that they've been underinvested in traditionally by traditional political givers is one of Soros's big, stocks in trade, as is the fact that the candidates he has been drawn to, both the prosecutors and the more marquee people like Obama and Stacey Abrams or Maya Wiley more recently when she ran for mayor of New York, those are the people that George Soros, wants to invest in. His foundation after George Floyd gave, hundreds of millions of dollars to support the movement for Black lives. So I think the only way to, Soros has been resistant, although many people have tried to get him to do it, to give himself a bigger megaphone. A lot of people have said, buy CNN, buy network, whatever, who can put his thumb down on the scale the way that the Murdochs do or the way that Fox News does. He hasn't been interested in that. He has been interested in putting his weight and his money behind, if you will, people power. And, Ava, made some remarks that about, or you asked a question about the way the world has changed in terms of Soros's values. And I close my political chapter with that. It would be hard to make the argument that for all the open society values George cares about and is invested in for 30 or 40 years, it would be hard to make the argument that we're in a very good place with respect to those. And people like myself, who devoted their entire careers to civil liberties and human rights and open society values, it's a troubling moment. And yet I have to say, back to the Ukraine, which we've talked about a couple of times, that, as awful as the situation is with the rise of autocrats like Putin or, enablers of him like Trump and, the right in all countries, the response of the Ukrainian people and the response of the world to the bravery of the Ukrainian people has actually been, in my view, an enormously uplifting thing, and very much in sync with the kinds of investments that Soros has made, both in Eastern Europe over 3 decades and also in the United States. Ultimately, I have to believe that that'll prevail over the autocrats.
One of the things that needs to be said about George as a 91-year-old Eastern European-born Jew is he appreciates irony and paradox. And I think the idea that Ukraine today is led by a Jewish son of Holocaust survivors who was a comedian has got to be something that George would appreciate. It's not necessarily what was predictable. I think the wonderful thing, and we're going to go to questions now, is that George is now in a position where he looks back, as I said, in his 10th decade. And what his accomplishments have been are remarkable, not by any means universally successful. But what we've tried to do with the book is capture as much as possible in a single place what George has done. I will tell you that there are parts of George's life that we don't touch because it's none of our business. His family. That's something that George would have to do. And I don't suspect that we're ever going to get a biography of George, an autobiography of George, in which he talks about things like that. But he's a man who has an extraordinary capacity for generosity, personal generosity and friendship, which is surprising. And I think finally, I would say that he, to this day, well, literally on this day, he will be issuing some major statement in support of the Ukrainian people. A day does not go by that George does not speak up on behalf of the things that he thinks are important. So that really is the message. And Brad, are you going to give us the question?
Peter, can I just, before you go, because there aren't too many questions actually so far, and one is about the response to the book, and another is from somebody who thinks that Black Lives Matter and Antifa are ruining the country, which we could address, but I'd rather not. But I wanted to say something that I read Eva's chapter with great interest, and it was terrific. And I think I know Soros well, but I learned a lot, even more about him from reading her chapter. And I wanted to say that, I've noticed over the years, and her chapter reinforces this for me, that the philanthropist and the political investor, but I know the philanthropist better because I worked for him for 11 years, helping to give out his money, is very much in character with the way he was raised. You've touched on that a little bit. The appetite for risk, which is enormous, both as an investor, which I'm less capable to address, but Sebastian Mallaby does in the book, and the ability to make, quick decisions. And his worldview was shaped by the experiences that Eva writes about. For instance, he's a very anti-ideological person, both Nazism and communism up close, and doesn't really care for it, and is very suspicious for that reason, almost too suspicious in my view, of people's movements or mass movements. When he was a young man in England, I don't think Eva writes about this, he broke his leg and was taken care of by the National Health System. And that made a big impression on him, that as an immigrant, he was able to avail himself of the British welfare state. Well, I don't know, 50 years later, when President Clinton signed an awful welfare reform bill at the kind of point of a gun from the Gingrich Congress that stripped legal immigrants of social welfare benefits, he took R.A. Nair, then the foundation president, and me aside after a meeting one day and said, I'm really outraged about this because I had this happen to me, and I want to help immigrants. I'd like to spend $50 million to do this. And so that was a lot of money, even at the time and now. I never had access to that much money. We hadn't even planned to deal with immigration in the foundation, but he set us to work on it. And 3 weeks later, we'd hired a director and began to spend $50 million to help immigrants. And in fact, over a couple of years, we managed to restore the benefits, $16 billion worth of benefits. But George was able to move very quickly, and he was really inspired by his own experience. The same is true of the work he's done in the United States on death and dying to improve care at the end of life. I think Darren Walker writes about this in his chapter on philanthropy. His father died kind of death alone and in pain and in ways that none of us wants to die. And his mother, who had been a member of the Hemlock Society, died with her pain being dealt with her family around. And he wanted to do something to promote a better kind of death for people, access to palliative care. So, I don't think his philanthropy is entirely autobiographical, but the roots of it are very much there.
That's very good. Ava, do you want to add something there?
No, just to add simply that what this means is that he knows that he connects the personal and the political.
Right.
That his philanthropy, his actions, his convictions arise from his personal experience, which is then, extended into larger issues.
Right. What's really quite unique about Soros's approach to these things is how instinctive it is, how much it comes, how organic it is. One of the points that we make in the book is that George has a lot of advisors. There's a lot of counselors, but he makes the decisions. As long as George is extant, he will make the decisions based on his instincts. They're not always right, but let me finish, Gary. But they have been enormously consequential. I don't want to lose the opportunity if there are questions that I can't see it because I didn't turn on the question thing.
Well, as I said, there's a couple of questions about how bad Stacey Abrams.
But Brad, you want to read the question thing?
Well, I mean, Garris answered a couple of them, and you can see them. But on this point that you were just making about his advisors, there is a question from Marjorie that says Soros trusts great people who advise him well. One of the best things about him. True, Gara?
Well, it'd be self-serving of me to say so. I was one of them. But I was going to make a different point, which is not necessarily disagreeing with Peter. But yes, Soros is a decisive person and is makes a lot of decisions. But I think what's distinctive about Soros's philanthropy, in contrast to almost any other that I can think of, is how devolutionary it is and how much is delegated. His foundation network actually involves entities in 50 or 60 countries, including the United States, where people in those countries, very often, for instance, in a place like Guatemala, indigenous people, in a place like Baltimore, a majority Black foundation, in other places, people who have never, Roma people who have never access to commanding resources. He sets the broad outlines of what they're to deal with, provides the money, they make the decisions. So that's very much in contrast to the Ford Foundation or the Gates Foundation. I don't think there's a philanthropist in the world who has actually empowered others to direct his money within the broad framework of the values that he articulates as George Soros. And I've always thought it's one of the most distinctive and attractive things about his philanthropy.
There's a question here from an anonymous viewer. Has Soros selected anyone that he's mentored as a person to carry on his voice? Too often this person says the baton gets dropped.
Gara, I'll take that one because it's a really interesting question on which I have now spent a certain amount of personal time. George originally thought that the foundation would end with him. At one point, Gara was president of Atlantic Philanthropies, which was a spend-down foundation in which the funder said, I'm going to spend it all and I'm going to end up in a basket. And that was originally George's vision. And then he has kind of, as time gone on, he's accepted that there will be a foundation beyond him. And I think we would say that the trickiest element in George's legacy may well turn out to be that. He has a son named Alexander, who's a PhD from Berkeley, who is clearly being the person brought along to pick up the mantle. And I think you have to wonder, you have to question how a foundation, how a philosophy, how an ethos as strongly defined in one person's vision will carry on beyond. Well, we know now this. Henry Ford would not be happy to know that Darren Walker was the president of the Ford Foundation. After all, Darren Walker is Black and gay. Henry Ford was a vicious anti-Semite. And so I think that the question of the evolution of the Soros in the future is very much something that has to take shape. Much of it will be up to Alexander, his son. Some of it will be up to the staff that's there at the foundations. He's a wonderful, excellent man. Mark Malloch Brown is now the head of the foundation. R.A. Nair, who was the first head of the foundation, who both Gara and I know very well, was extraordinary in the way he shaped and worked with George. Remember, when you're working with somebody like George Soros, it takes a certain amount of adaptation, because it's, after all, his money and his views. But George has enabled it to happen, as Gara says. And I think the future is really quite going to be quite important, both as a philanthropic exercise and for the rest of us, how something like the Soros legacy gets carried on.
If you have another question, let's hear it. Otherwise, I want to make a slight codicil to Peter's.
Yeah, go ahead, Gara.
No, only that I think I want to make clear to people that, it's not just the family and the staff. There are boards, and Soros, everywhere Soros operates, he has boards, and there's a global board and a domestic US board. Now, I think, honesty would require me to say that, although I'm a little rusty on this, having been out of the foundation for 10 years or so, that while Soros is alive, the boards are not fully operating, as autonomously as boards, what to do. But there are boards that are meant to govern the foundation. And yes, as Peter indicates, I think Alex is the vice chair of the foundation, is taking an increasingly active role in the philanthropy.
A couple of questions about the sort of the book itself, Peter. One is, how is the vision, angle, and rollout of this book different from those books by Soros, that you and Public Affairs published?
Well, as I said at the outset, the origin of the book was a discussion with George about, the possibility of his writing an autobiography, which was never going to happen. What we did in conversation was I said, George, I will choose the people to write on the various elements. Having been his publisher for 25 years, I said, George, either you trust me or not. And the condition has to be that every single one of these writers will have full independence in what they say. Because if they don't, then it's not a book. And George agreed that he would only read it when it was finished. And he kept his word. Then the issue was, how can you, Harvard Business Review, this book is a co-publication of the little imprint that my wife and I started called Platform Books, which published my memoir, has a couple of other books coming, but with Harvard Business Review Press. Why? Because it has a global reach and has global identity, and that's why they are, in fact, responsible for sales and distribution. I said that, how do we fund a book like this? Because each one of these writers is a writer. And if it's going to be taken seriously, they need to be compensated. So I came up with the arrangement with George and not with George, actually, but with his wife, that they would put up the money for the book, not as a donation, but as an investment. And every copy sold will have a royalty, and it will go to pay back their investment. And I am a co-investor with them, meaning it's a business venture, but an unusual one, which is, of course, given Soros is not surprising, but total confidence that he would not interfere, and the ability to get writers of the caliber of Eva and Gara, which we wouldn't have been able to do if we were in a position to have to, pay $1.25. So it's an unusual, and frankly, Brad, as I think that's the kind of thing that sort of makes a difference. Do it in a different way. There would not be a book if we didn't take this approach to it. And I hope, seeing the first reviews, I hope that people recognize that it is a book that's independent, hopefully thorough and fair, and was not, in fact, in any sense, a biography that he was responsible for.
It's a different kind of book, published in a different way, about a different financier and philanthropist.
Yes, that would be the case.
It's just different. Someone is asking, the book is just out, but someone's asking here, is the reception of the book going as well as you'd hoped?
It's way too early. The book's official publication date was on Tuesday, the 8th. So it's 1 week in. I think less than a week in. I think over time, people will find the book. I'm not at all surprised that Politics and Prose would be the first place we went to for an event, because it's the kind of audience that Politics and Prose attracts that may be long-term interested in the book. I'll tell you this. The first book I did with George was in 1998. It's called The Crisis of Global Capitalism. It was when Russia defaulted and there was a whole big problem. I was a brand new publisher of Public Affairs. We put the book out because George said, I want it out right away. And I said, how soon, George? He said, a week from Monday. We took care of it. But then we sold the rights in 35 countries. George is a global figure. And I think eventually that it will be read around the world. The one place that we have gotten an offer from so far that we did not accept was China, because they said they would please remove the China chapter, which we said we couldn't do.
So, one more question here. Can you please comment on Soros and Israel?
Gara or Eva, do you want to take that?
That's above my pay grade.
Eva? Eva, do you want to try?
It's well above mine, but I understand, that George is not, he's neutral on Israel. I mean, he is not, as I understand it, he is not a supporter or an enemy of it. I think, as far as I can tell, he doesn't like the kind of nationalism that Israel, Israel typifies, that Israel, practices. More than that, I do not know. I mean, I don't think he certainly absolutely does not deny his Jewishness, but neither does he stress it. It is not a kind of a primary aspect of his identity. And I think, his relationship to Israel probably reflects that.
I think that if you are, as he is, Jewish in the time that he has lived his life, he recognizes the importance of Israel. He's a secular man. He recognizes the importance of Israel. He recognizes how important it was that there was an Israel for the remnants of European Jews to find a home. But he is one of the people who believes that what's happened in Israel, particularly in connection with the Palestinians, is not an expression of the values that he believes in when it comes to human rights and so on. So it doesn't mean that he's doesn't believe in Israel. He believes in Israel very strongly, believes in Judaism very strongly, as Leon Botstein's essay points out. But that doesn't mean he's not critical. And I think that's very important to George. He will always be someone who, when he's critical, lets people know.
Well, we're out of questions, and we're just about out of time. Any closing observations or remarks that any of you'd like?
Yeah,
to
Garrett and both. So when you finished working on these essays, did you feel that the Soros you were representing was admirable, complicated, and difficult? What did you come away with, Gary, as a former person who was in his employ, Ava, as somebody who only came to know him? What's your takeaway about Mr. Soros? Garrett?
Well, I did a lot of research for the political chapter because while I was aware of it, I wasn't really, unlike the philanthropy, I wasn't doing it. And so, and I came away with a much greater appreciation for the kind of coherence of his political impact and how much impact he had actually had. I was critical in various places of Soros, in writing about him, and he's actually quite a self-critical person. So he's there ahead of me, but he thinks he sometimes injected himself too much into politics and made himself more of the issue, and he regrets having done that. Some people would say he spent too little money on politics. Rover Norquist, actually, who's a grudging admirer of Soros, and vice versa, said that he tried to buy elections on the cheap, and he could have put a lot more money in. He sat out the midterm elections of 2010, which Democrats got wiped out. He's a little too attracted to the, to charisma sometimes, and doesn't quite understand, grassroots leaders in the same way as he does kind of charismatic leaders. But those are all, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. So I've had an enormous amount of admiration for George over the years that I have known him. While I think there are critiques to be made of him, I think on the whole, in the political sphere as in the philanthropic sphere, he's been an extremely transformational figure.
Ava, you didn't know him. Now you do.
I didn't know him, and I wrote about his childhood. So so that doesn't touch so much on the sort of bigger issues that we have been talking about. I found him extremely sympathetic, extremely emotionally aware, extremely aware of his own, internal life, of his own emotional life, extremely willing to acknowledge all of that, to, to acknowledge the complexities of family relationships, for example, and his own sort of role in them. At some point he briefly went into a psychoanalysis, and that was very surprising, but very, very interesting. And I thought very admirable that he was quite willing, to talk about that and to mention that. Yeah.
I'm going to say thank you, but I just want to point out it's a good thing that we're ending, Brad, because my room is getting darker and darker.
I noticed that, Peter. I noticed that.
I'll turn on the light if you give me another half an hour.
Yeah, well,
But I think we're done.
Look, Peter and Eva and Gareth, thank you so much. There's so much to say, of course, about Soros. He's such an extraordinary figure, and the three of you have had quite a bit to say. It's been very illuminating about his multiple assets, but there's still more in the book, which I hope everyone watching will get and read. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of George Soros. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well.